The words landed like a gavel striking wood, final and unyielding. We've decided to reorganize the client relations department, Laura. Today will be your last day. The air in the sleek, glass-walled conference room turned heavy. Across the polished mahogany table, Jonathan Mercer, the firm's newly minted managing partner, met my gaze with a well-rehearsed expression. Corporate regret, laced with clinical detachment. He had been at Langston & Associates for barely 8 months, yet here he was, dismantling what had taken decades to build. 25 years. And this is how it ends? I kept my voice even. I see. And this decision, it's purely business. Jonathan gave a measured nod, sliding a manila folder toward me with practiced ease. Business decisions are never personal. A textbook response, one I'd heard many times before, just never directed at me. Janice from HR sat stiffly beside him, her hands folded, her eyes trained on a neutral spot just past my shoulder. This restructuring affects multiple departments, she added, as if that softened the blow. It has nothing to do with performance. I nearly laughed. Was that supposed to be comforting? At 58, I was the oldest in my division. I also had one of the firm's highest salaries, earned through years of unwavering dedication that had helped Langston & Associates evolve from a niche legal consultancy into an industry leader. I exhaled slowly, then asked the one question that mattered. Does Richard know, Richard Langston, the man who had hired me 25 years ago, the man who built this firm on the very relationships I'd spent my career cultivating? Jonathan's jaw tightened. All partners were consulted. An artful dodge. Richard had been in London for weeks, negotiating an expansion into the European market. I doubted he even knew this was happening. Jonathan, sensing my silence, forced a tight-lipped smile. We appreciate everything you've done, Laura. We've prepared a severance package, 2 months' salary, benefits through the quarter. Security will escort you while you collect your things. Standard protocol. Standard protocol. The irony stung. I had written that protocol. My name is Laura Whitmore. Until 10 minutes ago, I was the Senior Director of Client Relations at Langston & Associates, one of Boston's most prestigious legal consulting firms. I had dedicated my career to fostering trust, anticipating client needs before they voiced them, making them feel valued beyond their billable hours. In an industry where firms were interchangeable, I had ensured that we were irreplaceable. Now, I was being discarded like an obsolete policy memo. I gathered my belongings with quiet precision, the security guard shifting awkwardly beside my desk. A framed photo from a client gala, thank you notes from businesses I had helped navigate mergers and crises, a crystal paperweight Richard had given me for my 20th anniversary. My phone buzzed. A message from Elizabeth Stratton, CEO of our firm's largest client. Laura, I'm hearing troubling things. Quarterly review next week. Call me ASAP. I glanced toward Jonathan's office. He was already on the phone, no doubt attempting damage control. What he and the other partners failed to grasp was that client relationships weren't transferable. They weren't just names in a database or contracts to be reassigned. They were built on trust. Trust they had just severed with one reckless decision. I thought back to my first day at Langston & Associates in 1998, when the firm was nothing more than a small office with 17 clients and a vision. Richard had sat across from me in that initial interview, his eyes alight with ambition. Laura, numbers drive business, but relationships sustain it. Anyone can crunch figures, but not everyone can build trust. For 25 years, I had embodied that belief. While others chased promotions and office politics, I focused on being indispensable to our clients. I knew their children's names, their expansion goals, the subtle nuances of their corporate cultures. I anticipated needs before they became problems. At my 20th work anniversary, Richard had toasted me with a simple phrase: "Laura is the architect of our client relationships. She built the foundation of everything we do." But things had changed. 2 years ago, outside investors had come in, pushing for rapid expansion. Efficiency and revenue metrics began to take precedence over service. And then came Jonathan Mercer, the embodiment of corporate pragmatism. His PowerPoint-perfect strategies revolved around margins, not people. Now, standing amidst the remnants of my career, I realized something. They had cut me loose without a second thought, but they had also cut themselves off from something far more valuable. And soon they'd learn just how irreplaceable I truly was. Since Jonathan took over, staff turnover had skyrocketed by 40%. The firm's once unshakable motto, "Clients first," had been gutted and replaced with his new philosophy: maximize value extraction. I had raised concerns in executive meetings, warning that our short-term cost-cutting was eroding the foundation of our client relationships. We're compromising long-term stability for quarterly gains, I argued. Jonathan barely glanced up. Markets evolve, Laura. Adapt or die. Some of our legacy systems are frankly obsolete. Obsolete. That was his favorite word. It was also how I had felt for months. My exclusion had been gradual but undeniable. Meeting invitations stopped arriving. My inbox no longer contained key discussions. Junior associates, ones I had trained, were quietly added as secondary contacts to accounts I had managed for years. I reassured myself that my institutional knowledge, my relationships, and my track record would keep me safe. After all, I personally oversaw accounts that made up more than 60% of our firm's annual revenue. Elizabeth Stratton alone brought in nearly $4 million a year, and she had explicitly stated in her last contract renewal that she wanted me as her primary contact. But I had underestimated just how ruthless Jonathan could be. Last week, I overheard him on the phone. The restructure is the perfect time to trim the legacy fat. Their retirement packages alone will cost us millions. I should have seen it coming. But after 25 years, I made the mistake of believing loyalty still counted for something. Even 3 days later, the sting of humiliation remained. Being escorted from the office like a security threat after a 10-minute meeting wasn't something you shook off overnight. Now I sat in my apartment, surrounded by open job-hunting websites and unread texts from former colleagues, unsure which ones were genuine and which were fishing for office gossip. My LinkedIn profile views had spiked, nothing like an abrupt layoff to make you momentarily fascinating. The landline rang, an almost foreign sound in an age of texts and emails. I hesitated, nearly letting it go to voicemail, until I saw the number. I answered. "Hello? Laura, it's Richard." His British accent, usually so composed, was tight with tension. "I just got back from London and heard the news. This was not authorized by me." A rush of emotions collided inside me. Relief that Richard hadn't sanctioned my firing, anger that it had happened anyway, and a sharp sense of betrayal that he hadn't stopped it. I kept my voice neutral. "Well, it happened nonetheless." Jonathan said all partners were consulted. Richard exhaled sharply. I was deliberately cut out. They waited until I was overseas dealing with EU regulatory issues. The executive committee pushed it through as an emergency restructuring to boost the next quarter's projections before the investor conference. My jaw clenched. 25 years, Richard, and all I got was a 10-minute meeting and a severance package. "You deserved far more," he admitted, his voice heavy. "I want to make this right. What if I brought you back? We can call it a miscommunication, a procedural error." I cut him off. "It's not that simple. Jonathan made it clear he sees me as expendable. I overheard him calling me legacy fat. Silence. And then, an exhale of understanding. He knew. Once leadership undermined you, your effectiveness was finished. There was no coming back from that. I'm sorry, Laura. Truly. This firm was built on the relationships you nurtured. I let the moment stretch before asking, and now that I'm gone, how are those relationships holding up? The pause on the other end told me everything. Finally, Richard spoke. Jonathan reassigned your accounts to the junior partners. Elizabeth Stratton is with Emily Harrington now. I laughed under my breath. Emily? The same Emily that Elizabeth openly clashed with in last year's strategy meeting? She called her approach rigid and short-sighted. Richard didn't reply. He didn't have to. As I hung up, my phone lit up with notifications, texts, emails, and missed calls. Elizabeth, Benjamin from Archer Pharmaceuticals, Kimberly from Summit Financial, the entire senior team at Westridge Manufacturing. Word had spread. I hadn't reached out to a single one of them, and yet they were all reaching out to me. Since his arrival, Jonathan had transformed Langston and Associates from a client-focused firm into a ruthless machine of cost-cutting and turnover. Staff departures had surged by 40%, and relationships that had taken decades to build were now secondary to efficiency metrics. I had raised concerns at executive meetings, warning that prioritizing short-term gains over long-term stability would backfire. We're undermining the foundation of client trust, I'd said. Jonathan had barely looked up. Markets evolve, Laura. We either adapt or become obsolete. That word, obsolete, had followed me like a shadow in recent months. Meeting invitations stopped coming. Email threads I once led continued without me. Junior associates were quietly introduced as secondary contacts for clients I had personally nurtured for years. Still, I had believed my track record, my institutional knowledge, and the sheer weight of my client portfolio would protect me. I was wrong. 3 days after my unceremonious firing, the humiliation still lingered. I sat in my apartment, surrounded by open job hunting tabs and unread messages from colleagues, some sympathetic, others fishing for office gossip. My LinkedIn profile views had skyrocketed. Nothing like a high-profile dismissal to make you momentarily fascinating. The doorbell rang. A courier handed me an envelope, thick and embossed. Inside was a formal letter from Elizabeth Goldstein, one of the most well-connected headhunters in Boston's consulting world. Tucked inside was a handwritten note. I heard what happened. Several firms would value your client portfolio. Dinner tomorrow? I placed the letter down, recalling the smug satisfaction on Jonathan's face when he had pushed that severance packet across the table. I had no intention of sabotaging Langston and Associates. I didn't need to. They had already done it to themselves. The next morning, my phone rang at exactly 7:38 a.m. Elizabeth Stratton did not waste time on pleasantries. "Tell me you're not really gone," she demanded. "I'm afraid I am," I replied, bracing for the fallout. "Bullshit." Elizabeth's voice was sharp. "For 12 years, I've worked exclusively with you. Yesterday, Emily Harrington emailed me, introducing herself as my new relationship manager. That woman once tried to explain my own business model to me. Where are you going next?" "I haven't decided yet." "Decide quickly," she snapped. "Our contract with Langston and Associates is up for renewal in 60 days. I'd rather follow you." This was the moment where professionalism dictated that I reassure her. Tell her that despite my departure, Langston and Associates would continue delivering the same level of service. But I had no interest in protecting a company that had discarded me like dead weight. "I appreciate your confidence, Elizabeth," I said instead. "Let me consider my options and get back to you." By noon, 5 more major clients had called. By dinner, that number had climbed to 11. I hadn't reached out to a single one of them. I hadn't needed to. That evening, I met Elizabeth Goldstein at an upscale restaurant in Back Bay. She studied me over the rim of her glasses as she placed her order. "You're the talk of the industry right now," she said. "Jonathan Mercer just made the worst mistake of his career." "Perhaps," I said, non-committal. She laughed, always so diplomatic. "That's part of your appeal." She slid a folder across the table. "3 firms want to meet with you. 2 are creating a position specifically to bring you and your client base on board." I flipped through the pages and nearly choked on my water. The salary offers were nearly double what I had made at Langston and Associates. Elizabeth smirked. "They're not just paying for your expertise, Laura. They're paying for your little black book." The irony wasn't lost on me. Jonathan had considered me too expensive to keep. Now his competitor saw me as twice as valuable. I wondered if that factored into his cost-cutting analysis. The next morning, Richard Langston called again. "I need to see you," he said, his usual composed tone laced with frustration. "Can you come to the office?" "Given the circumstances, that seems inappropriate." "Then lunch, 1 o'clock at Harvest. Laura, you need to hear this." Curiosity won. At precisely 1 p.m., I stepped into the restaurant to find Richard already seated. He looked exhausted. "Thank you for coming," he said, the relief evident in his voice. "I've been trying to fix this, but Jonathan is blocking me at every turn. He convinced the board that your termination was critical to realigning our strategy." "And how's that strategy working out for the clients?" Richard grimaced. "Not well. Elizabeth Stratton has called an emergency meeting with the executive team. Benjamin from Archer is exploring alternative firms. 3 smaller clients have already severed ties." I took a sip of water and said nothing. Richard leaned forward. "Here's my proposal. I create a new position, Chief Client Officer. You'd report directly to me, bypassing Jonathan entirely. Better salary, more autonomy." It sounded perfect. Too perfect. I studied his face, looking past the polished proposal, past the concern. Then I saw it. Fear. "What aren't you telling me, Richard?" He hesitated, then exhaled. "Jonathan is maneuvering to push me into early retirement. He's consolidated power among the newer partners. If the client situation worsens, he'll use it as leverage to force me out." And there it was. Richard wasn't trying to save me. He was trying to save himself. I set my napkin down. "I'm sorry, Richard, but I already have meetings scheduled with other firms." His shoulders sagged. "Laura, don't do this." I met his gaze. "Business decisions aren't personal." For the first time in our 25-year history, Richard Langston was on the receiving end of those words, and the look on his face almost made it worth it. Over the next week, I met with each of the 3 firms Elizabeth had recommended. The meetings followed a familiar pattern, one I now controlled. Compliments flowed easily in every meeting. Praise for my client relationships, careful questions about who might follow me, and increasingly tempting offers. I found myself drawn to Langford Advisory, a firm that reminded me of the old Langston and Associates, back when client trust mattered more than quarterly targets. Their offer wasn't just lucrative. It included something I had never been given at F&A, an equity partnership, a seat at the table, a say in the firm's future. Meanwhile, Langston and Associates was unraveling faster than I had predicted. Industry blogs buzzed with rumors of client dissatisfaction and internal turmoil. My former assistant, Daniel, kept me informed through quick, clipped texts. Elizabeth Stratton walked out of a meeting with the executive team, livid. Benjamin from Archer canceled his quarterly review. Even Westridge Manufacturing, a client known for its institutional loyalty, was rumored to be shopping for alternatives. Then came the call that changed everything. Laura Whitmore, I answered, scanning over Blackwell's offer letter. Ms. Whitmore, this is Robert Sinclair from the Boston Business Journal. I sat up, suddenly alert. The Business Journal wasn't just another publication. It was the corporate pulse of Boston. I'm working on a piece about Langston and Associates, specifically their leadership shakeup and the impact on client relationships. Several sources have mentioned your name. Would you be willing to comment? This was dangerous ground. Anything I said could be construed as an attack on my former employer, potentially violating the non-disparagement clause in my severance package. I'm not in a position to comment on Langston and Associates' internal matters. Understood, Sinclair replied smoothly. But what about the reports that 7 major clients have already signaled their intent to sever ties with F&A? Industry sources suggest this exodus is directly tied to your departure. 7? I had spoken with 15 clients, but none had explicitly stated they were leaving. I can't speak to clients' decisions, I said carefully. There are many factors that go into selecting a consulting partner. I heard Sinclair typing. One more question. Any thoughts on the letter signed by 26 of F&A's clients demanding that Richard Langston remove Jonathan Mercer as managing partner? I nearly dropped the phone. I wasn't aware of any letter. When I hung up, I sat motionless, stunned. 26 clients? Was there an organized push to oust Jonathan? I hadn't orchestrated any of this. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. Emergency all-hands meeting called for tomorrow morning. Partners flying in from everywhere. Jonathan looks like he's about to have a stroke. An hour later, Richard called. Did you organize this client revolt? He demanded, skipping pleasantries. I've done nothing, Richard. I haven't approached a single client. His voice was tight, verging on desperation. Then how do you explain this? 70% of our client base is threatening to walk. The board is in full panic mode. Investors want answers I don't have. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch. Then, with deliberate calm, I said, maybe they prefer stability over cost-cutting efficiency. This isn't a joke, Laura. His voice cracked with something I had never heard from him before. Fear. 25 years of growth, and we could collapse in 25 days. A bitter part of me savored his panic. I had been loyal for 25 years, and when the time came, Richard had done nothing to protect me. What do you want from me, Richard? Come back. The words came fast, like he'd been holding them in. Not as chief client officer, as a full equity partner. Help me stabilize this before it's too late. Partner. The title I had deserved for a decade, always dangled in front of me but never given. And Jonathan? Richard's voice hardened. The board is meeting tonight. His fate will be decided before tomorrow's all hands. I glanced at Blackwell's offer. It was clean, safe, a fresh start, with higher pay and no messy history. But at Langston and Associates, I had spent 25 years building something real, relationships that weren't just contracts and numbers, but the sum of my entire career. I need to think about it, I said finally. I'll give you my answer in the morning. That night, sleep never came. I paced my apartment as the clock inched toward dawn, replaying every conversation, every betrayal, every possibility. Going back meant facing the colleagues who had silently watched my humiliating departure. It meant stepping into the wreckage Jonathan had left behind. It meant trying to salvage a firm whose culture had been eroding for years, knowing that a leadership change wouldn't fix everything overnight. And yet, it also meant reclaiming what had been taken from me. By sunrise, I had made my decision. The allure of Blackwell was undeniable. A fresh start, a firm aligned with my principles, and a partnership that recognized my value in ways Langston and Associates never had. Their offer wasn't just generous, it was an investment in the future I was ready to build. By 6 a.m., my decision was made. I called Elizabeth Goldstein, knowing she'd be awake. "I'm going with Blackwell." She didn't hesitate. "Smart choice. They'll be thrilled." But I wasn't done. There was one more condition. As I explained, Elizabeth listened, then laughed, a sharp, knowing sound. "Laureless Langston. I love it. I'll pitch it to them this morning." At 8:45 a.m., I stepped into Langston and Associates for the first time since my dismissal. The receptionist's eyes widened. "Miss Whitmore, are you here for the all-hands meeting?" "I am. Richard is expecting me." The conference room was packed. Partners, board members, junior staff crammed against the walls. Even those who typically dialed in had flown in for what promised to be a reckoning. Jonathan Mercer was conspicuously absent. Richard stood at the front, his relief evident the moment he spotted me. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice measured. "As you know, recent personnel decisions have led to significant client unrest." His gaze flickered to me. "I'm pleased to announce that Laura Whitmore has agreed to return to Langston and Associates as a full equity partner, leading our newly formed client relations division." A murmur rippled through the room, whispers of shock and skepticism filling the charged air. Richard lifted a hand, silencing the noise. Additionally, the board has unanimously voted to remove Jonathan Mercer as managing partner, effective immediately. His approach was ultimately deemed incompatible with our firm's values and long-standing client commitments. The energy in the room shifted, a mix of disbelief, relief, and a growing realization that the firm's balance of power had just been violently recalibrated. Then Richard turned to me. "Laura, would you like to say a few words?" I rose slowly, taking in the faces before me, some hopeful, others wary, all watching intently. Daniel caught my eye from the back of the room, offering a subtle thumbs up. "Thank you, Richard," I began, my voice even. "And I appreciate the offer to return as a partner. But before we go any further, there's something I need to clarify." Richard's expression barely flickered, but I caught the slight tightening of his jaw. "I'm not coming back to Langston and Associates." Silence fell, thick and absolute. A few board members exchanged uneasy glances. Richard's face froze in confusion. I continued. "Instead, I'm here to announce that I have accepted a partnership at Langford Advisory, which has just finalized acquisition negotiations with Kensington Ventures to purchase a controlling stake in Langston and Associates." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, a few outright expletives. Richard looked as though he had been struck. I let the chaos settle before delivering the final blow. "The transition begins next week. Blackwell and Kensington respect the expertise and relationships built here. There are no immediate plans for widespread restructuring, though changes will be made as necessary for efficiency." Richard stepped forward, his voice tight. "Laura, what did you do?" I met his gaze steadily. "I did nothing, Richard. Blackwell has been looking to expand its presence in Boston for years. Kensington Ventures, the firm's largest shareholder, saw the opportunity amid recent client volatility. That's just business, nothing personal." As the realization sank in, I saw it, the shift in Richard's eyes, the weight of his own failures pressing down. He hadn't protected me when it mattered. He had traded loyalty for short-term gain. And now he was facing the cost. The conference room was in chaos as I turned and walked out, head high. My phone buzzed. A text from Elizabeth Stratton. "Just heard the news. Dinner tonight to discuss Stratton Healthcare's transition to Blackwell Langston?" I stepped into the elevator, a slow smile forming. I hadn't sought revenge, but justice had arrived all the same. The next morning, the Boston Business Journal ran the headline, "Consulting Shakeup. Blackwell acquires Langston and Associates amid client exodus." The article detailed how the loss of a key senior executive triggered an unprecedented client revolt, leaving the firm vulnerable to acquisition. My name was mentioned once, buried in the 15th paragraph. Laura Whitmore, former Senior Director of Client Relations at Langston and Associates, has joined Blackwell as a partner and will oversee client portfolio integration. A clinical summary of a seismic shift. Within 3 weeks, I had gone from discarded employee to the architect of the very firm that once dismissed me. Integration meetings began immediately. I worked from Blackwell's offices, reviewing organizational charts and client rosters, preparing for the transition. Every day, former Langston colleagues found their way to my door, some seeking reassurance, others suddenly remembering how they'd always admired my work. And then, 1 week after the acquisition announcement, Richard requested a meeting. I agreed. He arrived looking 10 years older, 20 pounds lighter, and entirely out of options. "You orchestrated this," he accused, sinking into the chair across from me. It wasn't a question. "No, Richard," I said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I simply recognized my worth, even when you didn't." "You allowed the company to erode from the inside," I said, my voice steady. "You prioritized expansion over loyalty, efficiency over relationships. You forgot what made this firm thrive in the first place." Richard exhaled sharply, his expression carved from stone. "And now you have complete control." "Not control, Richard, influence. There's a difference. You used to understand that." I slid a document across the desk. "Blackwell is offering you a 3-year consulting contract. Advisory only, no executive authority. It's a generous deal considering the circumstances." He skimmed the page, then met my gaze. "And if I refuse?" "Then you walk away with nothing but your ownership payout. The choice is yours." 6 months later, Blackwell Langston Consulting occupied 2 gleaming floors of a downtown high-rise. The transition had been smoother than anyone anticipated, largely because I had insisted on retaining the majority of Langston's employees, valuing them in a way their previous leadership had failed to. Jonathan Mercer had faded into irrelevance, relegated to a mid-tier firm, his career permanently marred by the implosion he orchestrated. Richard had accepted the consultant role, but remained distant. Our conversations were strictly professional, and the weight of his betrayal, his failure to stand by me after 25 years, was something neither of us could fully erase. In my office, I reviewed the quarterly numbers, allowing myself a rare moment of satisfaction. Client retention had exceeded 95% through the transition. The 3 accounts that initially defected had already returned. Revenues had surged by 23% year over year. A knock at the door. My assistant stepped in. "Miss Stratton is here for your lunch." Elizabeth entered, radiant as always in a sharp, tailored suit. "Congratulations on your quarterly results," she said, setting her bag on the chair. "The industry is still talking about the most masterful corporate acquisition in years." I smiled. "It wasn't an acquisition, Elizabeth. It was a market correction." She laughed. "You proved what I already knew. In consulting, relationships are everything. The rest is just infrastructure." As we stepped out for lunch, I let my mind drift over the last 6 months. I never set out for revenge when Langston and Associates discarded me. I never had to. They had failed to grasp a simple truth. Clients don't stay for a firm's processes, branding, or cost efficiency. They stay because they feel understood, valued, and prioritized. By severing me, Langston had unknowingly orchestrated its own downfall, and in doing so, They had propelled me into the position I had deserved all along. Sometimes, justice isn't something you take. Sometimes, it finds you.